Going that. Excellent. Right. Good. So, just coming into the room now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Facebook Live in the Emotional Wellbeing in Animals group. I'm really excited about this. Welcoming my dear friend and colleague, Robert Falconer-Taylor. Hi, Robert.
Good evening, Andy.
How are you doing?
Good to be here. I haven't got a little red dot saying you're recording.
Yeah, no, we're good. We're live and we're on.
Fine. Good.
Yeah, we're all good. Do say hi as you come in the group. Let us know where you are in the world as well. I can see we've got viewers, which is great, but do say hi in the chat. And so we set up this new group, Emotional Wellbeing in Animals, because of this notion of how important emotional wellbeing is. This kind of tag phrase we've got now, which is emotional wellbeing matters. Period, really. And of course, I've been involved very much with dogs more specifically, but this group is about looking at animals more generally. And this is going to be a really important conversation to introduce this, to think about why emotional well-being matters, and more broadly, why it really matters to all species that we're going to reference today. And we're going to kind of dig deep on some different things. And this is a great introduction, I think, for us to ask a lot of these questions. And I couldn't think of anybody better, Robert, than yourself.
Oh, bless. I'm blushing.
Before we begin, just say hi to people. Hi, Sharon, Cambridgeshire. I've got Wiltshire, I've got US, got Kentucky, New York, Chicago. Hi, everybody. Warwickshire. Hi, Leslie. Hi, Fran. Hi, Chris. Good. People coming in and saying hi. And we've got a really good. Yeah, Forteventura. Good. Canaries. We do love the Canaries. Yeah, so good to see you all. Keep saying hi. Keep letting us know where you are. So, Robert, for those who don't know you, I shall give you your full title, Dr. Robert Falconer-Taylor. Just give us a little flavour of your kind of background and your interest in this.
Yes, right. My background, I cut my teeth in veterinary back in the 1980s. And I spent a little bit of time doing mixed work, some farm animals, then horses, and then gravitated over to cats and dogs. I then in early 2000s started becoming interested in behavior because those kind of cases were coming into the practice. And so what I did is I started drifting over towards that. And by 2005, 2006, I was very lucky enough to get a tutor role within COPE, the COPE Association of Pet Behaviorists and Trainers. And I've never looked back, really. I gave up veterinary work completely in 2006 and became a full-time behaviorist. And I've really kind of drifted into academia since then. I don't do practical behavior work, partly for practical reasons, because I live so far away in the Northwest Highlands, so it's quite difficult to reach out. We've got lots of border collies here, but not much else. And a few rescue animals. So that's been my journey, really. And I guess because I come from a clinical background, my interest still lies very much within the evidence base and the anatomy. I think anatomy is really, really important. If you understand anatomy, you understand an awful lot about behavior. And of course, my time in COPE really taught me about thinking about emotions too. And the idea that anthropomorphism was something that one should celebrate and isn't a crime, which it certainly was when I first came into the industry back in the early 2000s. There were people who I won't name who are very much in the camp that only humans feel emotions and have consciousness. And then, of course, at the other extreme, there are a few that are shouting against that, like Jaak Panksepp and others. And so I've been kind of in that train and spend most of my spare time exploring those sort of things. So I guess my contribution tonight will be more along the kind of anatomical side. I see you, Andy, as the kind of exemplar of applying this term well-being in a practical sense in what you do, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I think everyone knows the idea of well-being, and everyone knows that we ought to be making sure that the animals in our care should be having well-being. But to me, there seems to be a gulf in exactly what it is and actually pinning it down, and where one draws a line between things, animate things, living things that we needn't worry about well-being at all. Where does one draw the line between them and animals that perhaps are more complex, more evolved, if you like, and well-being starts to become a factor because they start to have feelings. So off we go. Let's go.
Yes, and I think I want us to look at. We'll come on to the drawing the line bit in a bit, I think, because that's a good place to
Yeah,
move to. I think because that's a
it
really
is.
fascinating point. At what point do you think, well, maybe this living thing doesn't feel enough to have to us to worry about it? And I think one important point you mentioned, the kind of almost celebrating anthropomorphism rather than distancing ourselves from it. I think part of the thing we've got to recognize is what is the factor here regarding the recognition that the other might have feelings and have their own emotional and safety needs. And often that is our own need to control outcomes based on our own versions of safety and need. I think this is always a tricky thing for us as humans to navigate, of course. But emotional well-being matters. It matters for us. It matters for our horse. It matters for our cat, our dog. And I say we'll start looking at other species and think about where that line is. But what's interesting for me is, especially with my human psychology educational background, I think it's a good place to start, Robert, is to recognize how much of our own lived emotional experience we've come to understand neurologically, physiologically, biologically, from actually the study on animals and especially the humble mouse, which I know you've referenced a lot with these studies. So I think it's a good place to start, perhaps.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned humans and your work with humans. And I'm going to start by asking you a question, I think. If you imagine a ladder, and you imagine the best possible life you could have as, say, a 10, and the worst possible life you could have as, say, a 0, and I don't mean your life now, but I mean your overall experience of life, that is your well-being, where would you put yourself on that scale?
Guy, that's a really
How,
good question. I think
how would you rate it? Without you can use happy. Happy isn't a word that you can use because happy is in the moment. Happiness, well-being, are you content with life? It's that sort of question.
it is, and I think this is where it gets a bit more complicated, of course, for us, especially
Mm.
regarding about what criteria we want to use around well-being.
Yeah.
And well-being, welfare, all these kind of things are very much in the eye of the beholder. And I think a lot of it, many people would kind of boil it down to actually feeling you have some agency over predictabilities of outcomes and the ability to structure environment to continue to feel safe. I think these are things
Yeah.
that we see from a very primal point of view, because
Yeah.
for me, safety first on everything, but that's not just physical safety, but the notion of emotional and social safety too as a social species.
And what I liked is there's actually loads of data on this on people. So as people who work with animals, we kind of shine our anthropomorphic spotlight out to them. But what we can do is actually shine it back on ourselves and look at some of the data. Governments, corporations, academics have spent an absolute fortune on gathering data about what happiness actually is in people, because it's really, really important. I mean, if you're a government, you want your people to be happy and content. If you are a welfare person, a sociologist, you want the same thing. If you're an organization, certainly when I came into the workplace in the 1980s, it was the Thatcher years, and there was, greed is good and all that kind of thing. Corporations were basically doing psychometric tests on people to actually look at their suitability to become employed. And even then, in the old days of endowment mortgages, you actually had to be checked, and they checked your medical records. If you had any kind of record of lack of well-being or possibility of mental health problems, you would have a great difficulty in actually getting a mortgage. So these things are really important to organizations, and they're really important to people as well, individuals. And one of the things that I've been working with over the last year and fascinated and been following are these happiness and well-being surveys. And there are lots of them you can find online. Happiness report, well-being survey. So if you just look them up, you'll find there's absolutely tons and tons of data. And one of the things, the question I've just asked you about on a scale of 1 to 10, the ladder, is basically one of the basic questions they ask in the survey. And it's, yeah, as you say, it's really, really subjective. But that's a good thing, because if you ask 10 million people and you ask 10 million people over 2 decades or 3 decades, you then start to get a trend. It's purely subjective to that individual, but you start getting a trend as to what kind of things are important. And one thing I've found in this data is that they assess the answers they get back under 6 key variables. What those are GDP per capita, so the amount individuals earn in countries. So poorer countries, people have less money. In rich countries, they generally have more. Health and life expectancy. So that's a really important one. That would be a very human one, and we wouldn't expect dogs to worry about healthy life and their expectancy of life, or about the GDP for that matter. So that's looking into the future. Having someone to count on, I find that really interesting, because you think about a dog or a rat or any pet under our care, any animal under our care, even a bearded dragon, it's really important for them to have somebody, i.e. human carer, to actually count on to give them food and supply them stuff. So there we have some kind of metric which passes directly into the species that we work with. Freedom to make choices, number 4, is what you talk about. It's about agency. Another really, really important factor which swings that swingometer, if you like, of how well you feel you're doing at particular points in time. Generosity, I guess that's being generous to other people. So if you're somebody who gives a lot, you give an awful lot of your time and energy towards animal welfare, that adds points to your score of well-being over time, and over decades this would add up. And freedom from corruption. And I guess we could interpret that, if I was a dog or a horse or a rabbit, I might see that as freedom from being exploited by a breeder or something like that, being used with positive punishment techniques. Sporting horses is a good one. The amount of money in racing and dressage, and we won't talk about dressage, racing and polo and all those sort of things. It's full of corruption. And there was a lovely paper published in the Veterinary Record recently, basically surveying the dilemma and the conflict that exists in the veterinary profession in trying to look after the welfare of sport horses, and trying to satisfy the needs and wants of the owners of those horses, that want to keep those horses moving through whatever means they find they can get their hands on to make them more successful. So there are things that we can pick out just from that that survey, which I find really, really interesting.
Yeah, and I think a big part of what you've talked about there is an aspect of safety and well-being on our terms, actually, which is really brings us back to this notion of seeing the animal in front of us, the individual animal, and how we've very much perhaps in the past wanted to collectively group up not only individual animals but individual species. And one of the things that you and I have discussed about regarding a lot of what we know around emotional well-being and the, like you say, the neurobiological aspect of it is how universal that is, actually, regardless of species. Like you say, the species specific quirks and needs, but underneath that is this primary thing of feeling well and feeling safe, and what happens when we don't, or when the animal doesn't. And so maybe that's an area we can go into a little bit more now on that, start to go into some of the neurobiological side of things, the physiology side of things. Perhaps that might be a good segue into that.
Yeah. Well, I think one other point, just in this context, is the idea of expectation.
Yes.
Which is another big thing which comes up. And from the human point of view, it's expectation over the long term. And so what these surveys find, whoever you ask in whatever country, however poor they are or whatever, is that their feeling of well-being is pretty good when they're young, generally speaking, unless you're a kid working down a mine or working in a cotton mill or something. So when you're, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10, your expectations are really short term, because you haven't got that much life behind you, if you like. And so your expectations are fairly in the near term, and they're usually pretty optimistic, providing you've got fairly good parenting. We always think of talking to our teenagers about, and lecturing them about, they're living the best life they possibly can right now. Why are they moping around in their rooms and doing their Facebook or whatever? They ought to enjoy it, and then you go to college and university. But in actual fact, teenagers really aren't that happy. And I think it's because this is the world thing. It's not a narrow view. It's a world view from all the data, years and years and years of data. Their happiness starts to drop off, particularly when they go to college and start looking for jobs, because I think that when the point they reach puberty and adolescence, they're so optimistic. I mean, I remember that time, the world's your oyster, you feel so optimistic. And then just within those few years, you reach 18, you start to get more demands on you. You start to think about what kind of qualifications you need, what kind of job are you going to get once you're finished. And your expectations of how easy it was going to be when you're 14 or 15 or 16 are kind of somewhat blunted. And so there's a dip. And that gets even worse once you get into your early 20s and 30s, because you've got your job, and maybe it's actually a lot harder because you've had your 10-year plan when you're 20, that you're going to have a nice house, and maybe you're going to have a wee family, you're going to have a nice stable job, etc. But of course, a lot of that doesn't materialize either. So again, your expectation and your well-being is blunted by this expectation. And strangely enough, when you reach about 50, 60 and move on, suddenly your level of happiness, and again, this is worldwide, millions of people over decades, your levels of expectation become reduced, maybe because you think, well, most of my life is behind me, and your sense of well-being actually goes up. So it's strange, you get this U-shaped thing, whatever metric you look at, where it dips down, stays down, and goes up and down through your mid years and so on. It says my internet connection is unstable, and then starts to climb up again. And I wonder how this idea of expectation plays into the animals we deal with. Obviously, it depends on their lifespan. If you're a mouse, your expectations is just a couple of years old. If you're a tortoise, it's hundreds of years old.
And I think there's an extra dimension to that for me, because something else happens when we think about the amount of negotiated safety we have to employ when we're going through our teenage times, because of the societal and the expectational stuff that's put on us, not own, our own. And I wrote a little article recently called "What They've Got to Learn," because that's what gets said a lot, because the teenager doesn't want to engage socially, but they've got to learn. The teenager doesn't want to share communal changing rooms at school, but they've got to learn. And I think this is that notion of what it is you actually learn there regarding your ability to have that agency now, and to have safety on your terms. And of course, a lot of the time we have to learn, not necessarily that we become more sociable, we learn to have to cope with it more, we mask it more, we have to shift our emotional responses about how we feel able to feel emotionally safe. Of course, part of emotional safety is feeling safe to even communicate how we feel. And I think we definitely project that onto our companion animals when we're so constrictive over what that behavioral output. So I think it all connects, I think, for sure. And of course, as we get older, I think we do recognize we have more agency and choice, or at least we find those opportunities to ground where, okay, I can't be myself here, but I can here. So I said, and that improves that. And of course, I think, Robert, I'm definitely getting to the age now where I don't care so much what other people think so much, and that's quite freeing as well. I think we don't have the society, the kind of social brain isn't seeking that social approval so much as we are when we're younger, I think.
Yeah, really, I think you perhaps don't see that you have to compete so much. I don't know what it is. I mean, that's what I find. I'm kind of in my 60s now, and those sort of things don't matter. Because I'm much more content just enjoying the moment. And I wonder how that reflects with other species. You take a dog in particular that has a very close bond with humans, and of course some horses that are pets. Their expectation, I think, doesn't stretch into the future. They're lucky in that sense, unlike us who look too much into the future, and that's why we have so many anxiety disorders. But certainly they look into the future of expectation of going out for a walk and being fed, and not being taken to the vet, or being taken to the vet when they think they're going out for a walk, and you get that awful feeling of disappointment. So I think their expectation is just as important, but it works in different ways. And interestingly, this idea of expectation and life trajectories has been looked at in monkeys as well, in zoos. And it follows exactly the same curve, this U-shaped curve, where as very young animals, they're optimistic. as they become teenagers, they become less so, middle age, less so, and then when they get to them sort of mid-age, it starts going up again. And when they get quite old, they seem to be really, really happy. I can't remember how they actually measured well-being, but they found some way of objectively actually measuring well-being in these animals. I think it was the way they interacted with the keepers or with each other or something. It was some observational thing they managed to pick out. But I found that really interesting, because if you have that in primates, maybe it's something we could measure over a lifetime in a cohort of other species like dogs or cats or horses. Horses live a long time.
And this ties in, of course, with Karen Paneer's work with Mira.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
And how we can plot things in that kind of core affect space, mood state
Yeah,
things.
exactly. And I think the whole idea of this, the difference between being happy in the moment and well-being and happiness, is kind of parallel with the difference between an emotional state and mood state. I see mood state, if you turn to the psychology, mood state seems to be the something which you get a phase transition into a particular state where your valence is where it is on that scale. It's either good or bad. And it's once, because of the way the brain works, once you get caught in that slot of particularly poor valence, negative valence, it's really quite difficult to get out of it. It's like digging yourself into a negative hole. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit when we start looking at the how that works in the brain.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think especially when we get into the notion of kind of pessimistic and optimistic biases and things, and
Yeah.
how important that is when we're working with animals, actually, because if, like say, if they're in that more pessimistic bias state, which doesn't necessarily mean they're predicting something bad, but it's not necessarily the brains are able to acknowledge or predict something good, then it's tricky to even introduce reinforcement at that point, of course,
Yeah,
because
exactly. Well,
okay.
the idea to be able to protect basically is incredibly important, because it's how you decide to make a choice.
Yeah.
And it's very wise to be pessimistic about something if you usually live in a place where things don't go too well for you, like having a really bad boss. And the example I use is the classic example. If you're somebody who has a really bad boss and they always email you on Sunday night at 7 o'clock to ask you some stupid question, when that email arrives without even reading it, your heart sinks. But the other way around, and you're with a really good boss who only would ever email you on a Sunday night at 7 o'clock with really good news, like I've got some money for you, or I want you to stay off. You would open it with enthusiasm. You would be optimistic. And it's exactly the same with dogs. It's something that's actually built into us. And again, it's one of those things that we seem to find in animals, however far down, if you like, in the kind of tree of life we go. It seems to extend quite a long way down. And you get, I think there's work on pessimistic bees and things like that, isn't there? So really into the birth.
That's interesting. I haven't heard about pessimistic bees, but I have seen it. And I see it from just a general turning up to life and surviving it point of view. It has its advantages, but of course, anything that becomes chronic, it becomes maladaptive over time, because you miss the chance on the good stuff. So we have to be really mindful of that with that animal and help to find ways to shift that to be through that kind of spectrum, even incrementally, because it can make it help before we think about anything else. So let's so this has been a great start, actually, just thinking about well-being more generally, because we say, okay, emotional well-being matters. Well, what is well-being, and why does it matter? And I think we can think about it from not just on a how I'm feeling now thing, which is okay, but also how it is instrumental in defining us about how we turn up for life and how we cope with things and how we deal with interaction, especially as a social species. So let's go into whichever area you want to go into, really, Robert. We can look at the kind of physiology side of things. We can start to look at that, drawing the line. We can think about other species. You can throw some amazing things at us like you always do, whether it be bees or I think we're going to talk a little bit about snails, I think, at some point, because I'm into snails at the moment. So I'll let you take us wherever you want to now, Robert.
All right. I think I'm a bit pedantic about definitions. And so I think it'd be useful to pin down what we mean by well-being and what we mean by happy, the difference between happy and happiness. And then maybe, because my background was veterinary, clinical, animal welfare was an important aspect of that. And maybe we can talk a little bit on, having talked a bit about humans and measuring well-being in humans, turn to how we measure well-being in animals currently, which basically are things like 5 freedoms and stuff, because I think there's a little bit to unpack there. And then once we've done that and pulled that to pieces and criticized it, then maybe we can move into the area of consciousness and start looking at where we draw the line. I do want to have a dig at the 5 freedoms and stuff like that, because we can. So so if we start with some definitions first, the best definition I can find, and the one I always use, goes back to Aristotle 250,000 years ago. 2005, was it 2,500 years ago? That's right, 500 years old before Jesus Christ appeared. And he came up with this notion of hedonia, which I looked it up, and it's apparently a very ancient word, and it goes back to Homer. You know Homer? It goes back to prehistoric times. Prehistoric basically doesn't mean dinosaurs. It means the time before anyone started recording history and writing things down. So we don't have to rely on artificial relics, artifacts we find. We can actually find something written. And Homer was some bloke who roamed around, probably in the late Stone Age or Iron Age or whenever. And he wrote loads and loads of poetry. He wrote things like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And within those scripts, which apparently are brilliant, I've never read them because they're probably really boring for someone like me. But within those scripts are references to words that now, derive our word of hedonism. And where they come from is talking about things that are sweet, things that are pleasant, things like honey. And it's something that Aristotle picked up on. And he defined hedonism as something meaning pleasure in the moment. So something we explore. And for me, what that is how we talk about emotions, how we talk about appetitive seeking behavior in Panksepp's language, consumption, satiation. So that's what that seeking behavior is. So when we talk about happiness, or being happy at least, that's the kind of seeking side of things. He also came up for a word for the other side of it, the well-being side, and that's eudaimonia. And it's a word that has no translation in lots of other languages, certainly not in English. But what it means is basically something along the lines of reflection of a life well lived, well-being over time. So it's like if you like wine, it's like a really, really good wine. But if you like whiskey, like we all do up in here in Scotland, it's a really, really nice 20-year-old malt whiskey. It's something that only matures over time. So it's that sort of thing. So again, I think there's this time scale, and I like the way it clicks into mood states that we use as the technical psychology term for it in psychiatry and psychology. And it gives us this feeling of a clock. So we've got these hedonic moments, which are momentary, seconds, minutes, maybe hours, and then they drift into this well-being side, which really takes a long time to mature. So your sense of well-being isn't going to come along in a week or a month, or perhaps even a year, unless you're a mouse. If you're a very short-lived animal with a very short life, or if you're a small worm or something, you might die off in 3 days, or a fly, and therefore you might measure your sense of well-being in days. So there's this sense of having continuity and having a mood state, which again comes down to how the brain works. So that's how I got to the definitions anyway.
I love that. And I think again, just referencing Karen with mirroring the H in that is hedonic, the hedonic budget side of things. But
Exactly.
Also,
that's Aristotle.
And what you said there about the pleasure comes from the seeking, because we're very much been kind of convinced the pleasure comes from the reward.
Yeah.
And actually, that's not the case.
But it's kind of a combination of the both, isn't it? It's the seeking, and then it's the consumption as well. So the seeking is the kind of dopamine side, and then the consumption is the maybe the achievement side, which basically can be attached to opioids, enkephalins being released in the brain, so you get that feel good factor.
Well, my late uncle, he was a big stamp collector, and it wasn't, he loved his stamps and he loved them, but the joy came in trying to find them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the seeking bit.
Yeah.
And that's the part that becomes addictive. It's like being somebody with a metal detector.
So in a
You've
way,
got
then,
to catch.
his hedonia side of it was the finding the stamps, and over time, the
Yeah.
collection of his stamps became the eudaimonia of as a kind of as a representation of it. It's the life's work of
It's the
that
achievement.
happiness.
Achievement.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah. And
definitely
so,
so.
they're very different things.
Hmm.
And I love the idea that we have this word that was invented and it doesn't exist in English.
Well, yeah. Well, that's it. We didn't invent everything, did we?
No, no, exactly,
That's a
exactly.
nice something. Well, that's a great place to start. Great, thank you, Robert. So let's move on then. Now we've got that as a thing to consider,
Yeah,
looking through this lens. So at least we have a kind of a stable platform on which to stand now, I think.
yeah. Well, I want to look at, as I said, I want to have a poke at animal welfare and the five freedoms
Let's go for it.
because we can. And when I came into this industry, I cut my teeth on a book by John Webster, which was called, I think I bought it for more for the title than for the content, but it's called Animal Welfare, Limping Towards Eden. And I thought that's such a great title for a book. That's amazing. But basically, the guy is a professor of animal husbandry at Bristol, I think. Probably retired by now. The book was written in 2005, so it's really old. But I still have it on my shelf, and it's one of my go-to books. And what I love about it is because it makes you think in very fundamental terms about objective measures, because he worked mainly with farm animals, domestic animals, animals bred for food and so on. But it really makes you think about the nature of what welfare might be. And he framed that within three statements or three questions. And the first one is the animal living a natural life? And of course, what he meant by that is it a life which is species specific?
Mm.
It's in the right kind of environment, the right kind of animal. Should we be looking at that as a point of measuring welfare? The second question was that is the animal fit and healthy? So we're talking about a veterinary thing here, aren't we? We're talking about an animal that's fit, they're able to work or go about their daily business. They're healthy in the sense that they're free from disease. If you're a cow, you don't have rotting feet or something like that, or ulcers all over your teats, which is really, really painful when you put them in the milking parlor. And the third one is the animal happy? And of course, that's the really ethereal one. And that kind of gets us on to the five freedoms. So in relation to the first one, what's your take on the idea of in order for good welfare and therefore good well-being, an animal has to live a natural life, as in species specific, doing species specific things?
Well, I think it's an important foundation, of course, because
Yeah.
there are so many aspects of that, which is what our drives are, the responses we need to the feelings that we have in order to connect to that world around us, both for our joy, our protection, our survival, and I think there are some very you know for me I think there are two things. There are species specific needs
Mm.
and species specific way to communicate and interact for those needs. After that, a lot of other stuff is universal amongst species, I think, but it's understanding some of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that seems to be a sensible approach to me. And I try and think of as many different species as I can. And I guess if I had a bearded dragon in a cage, is simply the fact that the animal's in a cage compromising its welfare? And my argument would be, well, it's certainly not a natural environment. But the fact is, if its needs are met, and they spend an awful lot of their time just lying around and under the sun, and of course in a well constructed and welfare important cage, they would have everything they need. They have the water, the shade. They'd be given the insects that they can actually hunt for themselves, and they'd have the warmth. So from that point of view, I don't think I would have a problem with that. Some people might, but I don't think I would. But if you put a dog in a cage like that, then of course that would be a huge welfare problem.
But even
or
with the
amounts.
reptile, I think, I was gonna say, even the reptile, though, I think some of the things I'm learning, especially from people like the wonderful Daniela Beck, who does a lot of stuff on the reptile side of things. But and even I was at a conference recently, and there was somebody there talking about cats and about how a lot of the investigations now and some studies into cats showing that with a kind of a meat-based cat specific diet and the ability to perform some of the kind of action stuff, that actually they don't go out and kill just for the sake of it now because they have that certification, but they also are seeking more social connection, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And I think this is what Daniela's shared with me. Part of the Pet Remedy Summer of Love, Danielle's done a little 10-minute video for us, actually, which is coming out soon, about how once those things that you're talking about there, those basic things, we can actually enrich even more now, because the reptiles are like, okay, well, I feel quite safe with this now, and I can make a relationship up. It's quite interesting, the extra layers we can look at. Just to throw that in, but I understand what you're talking about there regarding the species side of things, for
Yeah,
sure.
well, I think it's one of those things where the reason I ask it is because there are organizations and groups that would say that really we shouldn't even be keeping dogs,
Yes.
because that's not natural. They're not in a natural environment. But dogs have, certainly domesticated dogs, are not same as wild dogs at all. They've adapted. They're, as you say, being a social species, they seek people out. Certainly there is some research that say dogs will seek out people in preference to their own mothers from about 5 weeks old. They prefer people. And you mentioned cats and sociability in cats. Cats are still undergoing domestication. I mean, most species are, but certainly with the way we're breeding cats now, they're still evolving, and particularly the exotic species, Siamese and Burmese and so on. They're the cats that suffer from separation problems and start meowing and pooing in the house, just like dogs do. So there is a shift. Even as we speak, evolution doesn't suddenly stop, domestication doesn't suddenly stop. And so it very much depends on breed. So I'm quite open-minded, I must say, about the idea of living a natural life. If you look at, let's just stick to dogs on this one. If you look at a lot of wild dogs, and I know your pals in India would know about this, the free roaming dogs. When you look at the research, most of the puppies don't live beyond a few weeks old. If they're not killed by distemper or rabies or starvation, and they're lucky enough to live a bit longer than that, very few of them reach a year old, and most adult dogs are dead, I think, by about 2 or 3 years old. So their life expectancy is very, very short. And a lot of that life is really quite rough, scavenging around. They've got injuries, they've got broken bones, they suffer chronic pain. I don't like the idea of that being a natural life for a dog. It might be in some places and in some circumstances, and maybe many hundreds of years ago. But I think hopefully we humans have moved on as a species to be able to release those animals at least from suffering. And I think the idea of not having to live a natural or live in a natural environment from that aspect is actually a positive welfare step for them. And I think you can say the same for many other species that are kept, exotic pets and that sort of thing as well. But it's controversial. It's a controversial one.
I think it always is, and I think there's always a balance to be taken there. And this is the thing about welfare. I did an animal welfare course with Edinburgh University, more widely, with a bit of an emphasis on farming. And they stressed a lot, actually, the lecturers, that welfare is in the eye of the beholder, and it's very rarely black and white. Because you have to think about the different aspects of it. So even animals, like you say, who are in a unnatural setting but are kept free from disease and pain, and there is a compromise there, though, about their natural ability to do the things that they would do if they were in the wild. I think there's always these kind of things. I think the hardest thing for us as humans is to feel that just because we can, we should. I think that's
exactly.
always another
Yes.
moral dilemma for us about what we get involved with. And I think definitely there is aspect of that when we think about the street dogs and that, and Sindor's a great person to listen to about her observations there and things. And okay, interesting, great. Well, yes, that was I think that's an important aspect there when we think about that. If we start coming away from that a little bit then and thinking about the level of sentiency, the level of awareness of, oh, I feel this, therefore I must act on it.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning about how we start to think about where we might draw the line there, and actually it's surprising. It's a surprising place, I think, when we really think about it.
Yeah.
Because we tend to think of four-legged furry things must have probably a feeling of something, but anything that hasn't got that, probably not. That's how it's been perhaps more widely viewed, but actually everything is pointing to the opposite. I think it's a lot broader than we might think.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, when you look at the declaration on selfhood in animals, the sentience, the first declaration, I think it was 2010, the Cambridge Declaration, and there was another one last year, wasn't there? The New York, where they've added a whole lot more species. I think the octopus is on there now. So
Yeah,
the line you draw is drifting down and down and down. You know, the octopus is really old, phylogenetically, 400,000 years. So it's pretty much just after when the vertebrates split off and developed the line that we're in. You have the sea sponges and that kind of stuff, and then the larval zebrafish. Vertebrates basically because they have a backbone, and that's a really important milestone because it means they have very different brains. That's when our brain, as we have it now, started to evolve with the three parts and the limbic system and all that kind of stuff. So it's a hugely important animal. Just before we leave the macro stuff on animals, I think anyone who's interested in this stuff really needs to read Clive Wynne and Monique Udell's book, Animal Cognition, which is now in the third edition, which I think came out in 2020 something. For a really well-written and easy to read book on animal cognition generally. So there's a lot about dogs in there, there's a lot about birds, lots and lots of different species and how they stack up with each other. I don't believe that you can understand dogs if you don't understand how they compare with other species, because you have loads and loads of studies coming out, Family Dog Project and this sort of stuff that says dogs can do this, dogs can do that. But my question is always, so what and compared with what? Because you don't know unless you have some sort of comparison. Okay, right. So animal cognition, and I don't get any commission on that.
Is that the Wynne Udell one, did you say?
Wynne Udell, yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, it's a really good readable book. It's not cheap. And it's not on Amazon Kindle or whatever it's called, but it's a really worthwhile book to have. And it's one of those ones, it's such an easy read and it's kind of entertaining read. It's so well written. So it's, you know, it's the book that I've always recommended as the go-to book to really pin down what you understand about animals. You know, comparative anatomy, physiology and behavior is really, really important.
Yeah, in the chat so people can see that. Wynne and Udell. Have I spelled that right? Make sure I have. Wynne, I should know Clive's name. Great. Wynne and Udell, great. Thank you,
Udell.
And also there was Limping Towards Eden as well, was another one, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't recommend everyone goes out and buys it. I think it's a great book. Most of it's about farm animals, so pigs and cattle and chickens and all that kind of stuff. But I think the way he sets out the arguments, I love. And I find it adds a lot to how I think about the 5 freedoms and also the 5 domain model. So anyway, it's a book I like. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone else will like it as well. That's right, fair. Where do you draw the line? I think for me, the only way to tackle that is to start thinking about consciousness, which again is this great mystery. And the problem with it is that when you start looking at what's out there, it's so flipping confusing. There are at least 10, 11 different categories of theories and studies. And within each of those, there are probably 5, 6, 7, 8 competing theories about it. And they range from the idea that only humans have consciousness because consciousness is linked very much with language, and without being able to communicate with language, we therefore don't have feeling. I'm not quite sure how that works, but nonetheless, there are lots of people who support that idea. Then there are individuals who support ideas like consciousness is something which is embedded in quantum physics and superpositioning and all this kind of stuff, which I think is completely untestable. And I'm not quite sure where one goes with that, because the fact is we have quantum events going on all the time inside ourselves. You know, that's how the world works. And so I'm not quite sure why consciousness has to be special and has to be a property of quantum physics. Everything's a property of quantum physics, actually. The solidity of your table is a property of quantum physics. The fact that it feels solid is because of the way quantum physics works. So that seems kind of nonsense. And then the other side is that everything's conscious. So you have this idea of panpsychism, where every single thing in the universe has the hallmark of consciousness in it. And if you want to dive down that rabbit hole, good luck to you, because it's really complicated. It's got some compelling ideas. I think it's is it Jeff Goff who wrote the most readable book I've read. I actually managed to get to the end of that one, and kind of slipped my wrists. So anyway, interesting. But even his ideas seem to go around in circles, as far as I can see.
I think we'll leave the emotional experience of rocks for another day.
Yeah, I think so, Andy.
We'll leave that one.
Deepak Chopra. Is it Deepak Chopra?
Yep.
He's the one that talks about rockness. But one thing I learned in veterinary is that this is in relation to doing cruciate ops and things like that, is if there are lots of different techniques and ideas about what the best explanation or procedure is, then the chances are that none of them are actually very good or correct. And so that's the way I see it. So whatever consciousness is, I'm not going to argue with it. But as far as I'm concerned, the most important property of consciousness, for what we're talking about, is the idea that an animal has to be complex enough to have a feeling of self. Because if you don't, you can't be conscious if you're not aware of yourself as a person. Now, we can take this to the extreme of a human, where we're so aware of ourselves that we spend all our time looking at ourselves on social media and posting our pictures on Instagram. And now we've got all these kids that are having to wean themselves off their addiction to their mobile phones and stuff. And of course, we then have, the serious side of it is we've got lots of psychiatric disorders, such as body dysmorphia and so on and so forth, because people have become anorexia, have become completely obsessed with their image. So that's the kind of extreme and the negative sides of having a self. And there are lots of people who say that consciousness has to have self, and they only see self through the lens of humans. Therefore, a crude example would be if you can see yourself, you recognize your reflection in the mirror, which of course is theory of mind in children, then you have a sense of self, you have theory of mind, and you can recognize that perhaps others have minds too. The thing is, kids don't develop theory of mind until they're 45 years old. And that's when it becomes really complicated and they become highly empathic, and they're very aware of that other people have theories of minds as well. But that doesn't mean that they're not conscious and they don't have a sense of self before the age of 4. What are they doing between 1 and 3? There are some pretty articulate kids at 3 years old, even 2 years old. They're walking around and chatting away in their own sort of baby language. And they certainly have a sense of self. And I think that's a really important property of what one has to have. And from an evolutionary point of view, if you wind the clock right back to the first animals that appeared on Earth, which is a long, long time ago, I can't quote you a figure, they were animals that lived in the ocean. All animals did. And the first of those animals were non-mobile. They were things that kind of stuck themselves on rocks and they just caught things as they floated by. And if they weren't getting enough food, what they would do is unimplant themselves from the rock and move somewhere else and pin themselves down to the rock again, and carry on feeding. And it seems to me that the first emergence of a sense of self in a complex animal has to be the ability to sense your surroundings. You need to know where your body begins and where things that aren't your body begin as well. Because if you couldn't recognize where your body was, then chances are, if you're something like a worm and you can turn around, you would see your tail and you would think it was food and eat it. So we have the development of things like touch, which is a really, really ancient sense. It's one of the first senses that evolved. Olfaction's even older. So we talk about pet remedy and the importance of olfaction, etc. It's a really, really old scent. Molecules floating around in the ancient oceans where all life lived at that time, and you detect others from that. So that has to be the first part of any kind of feeling of self, because what you're doing is you're detecting other things. Now, initially, that is a kind of, it's like a reflex. There's not necessarily, you don't have to have a sense of self like a mouse might or like a dog might. But from those roots, from those neurons and those synapses, that's where a sense of self, I think, could emerge. So
I was just going to add that I think that's really interesting, because especially when you think about what we're learning more now about the awareness, if you like, of that baby's nervous system to the environment and how
yeah,
it
exactly.
feels stuff through a lot of that kind of emotional circuitry, and whether it's a kind of connect or withdraw response, that is almost another sense of self, I think, from a nervous system point of view, let alone a cognitive one.
Yeah, and I think where valence comes into it is, it's just when you become a more complex animal, the first animals on Earth didn't, as far as we know, they didn't move, and so they had no real reason to have a nervous system, and therefore they had no real reason to be able to react in any strong way like we can to negative or positive stimuli. They just had to accept what was going past in the water. And as evolution progressed, there was an advantage to actually being able to move around as brains got bigger. And what you then need to do is have better senses. And so you can start developing things like eyes and noses and much more sensitive touch. So, you know, with eyes, they're great because you can see things a long way away. So you have a much better chance of escaping predators or finding prey. And it seems to me a natural progression as a brain develops and becomes more complex is that from that you have the emergence of something which gives what you're seeing or what you're smelling or what you're touching a sense of valence as well. So valence is just another dimension of being able to sense something, isn't it? And I imagine the first sense that would have developed would have been a negative one, because, you know, escape's really important. Escape is the best thing you can learn to do if you're an animal that can move, because you're not going to get eaten. And so having something which is akin to a very early version of fear is very, very useful as nervous systems grow more complex. And when we start to extrapolate that idea to more complicated animals which we have today, one line of evolution is the mollusks, which include octopuses and snails, your favorite subject, Andy, etc. And we now know how clever octopuses are. They're really, really smart animals. They don't just have one brain; they have 9. They've got a brain in each leg, and also a central brain where our brain is. And so it could be they have 9 sets of cells. I don't know. But the brain seemed to be autonomous in the tentacles. But then if you move to animals which are much simpler, like fruit flies or something like that, which don't have brains anything like ours because they're invertebrates, but they have these mushroom body things where they have collections of neurons. And certainly they have a sense of negativity and positivity. As I said, that you can measure pessimism and optimism in them. You can piss them off by, you know, stressing them and this kind of stuff, and they get really quite angry and they start fighting and they show an emotional reaction. And interestingly, certainly with fruit flies, one of the things that's been discovered is that fruit flies seem to experience a form of separation stress, which again brings us back to a snail, which of course is a very different animal because it's an invertebrate, but quite complex in terms of its brain. But Drosophila is really, really simple. It's got a very simple brain. It's a fantastic study animal, which is, it's one of my star animals. And if anyone wants to know anything about how emotions evolved and how brains work and that sort of thing, most of our knowledge has come from animals like Drosophila, melanogaster, and of course Caenorhabditis elegans, which is the little worm, tiny worm, which is even smaller. So they've got 309 neurons. Drosophila has something like, I don't know, 20,000 or something. We know the complete genome of those. We know the complete connectome. And though animals like that have taught us an awful lot, it's given us a way of studying things like sleep. It's given us a way of studying how drugs work in the body. It's given us a way of studying things like separation, particularly with fruit flies. Because if you isolate a fruit fly from a group and then you put it back in the group, it starts attacking the others in the group. And of course, we see this with dogs. They become quite angry, and with people, if you're separated, then being put back in a group, you can find suddenly having all those individuals around you quite overwhelming. And I think that's what happens with snails. And when I saw your snail thing on the group, I thought, yes, I know exactly why that is. It's to do with a neuropeptide called tachykinin. And the reason I know that is because I know that that is the neuropeptide, which is like oxytocin, a little short chain of amino acids, like oxytocin. Tachykinin, it's been preserved across species that when animals that can be subject to stress, i.e. animals that live together in groups, like bees or anything else, the levels of tachykinin go up in parts of their brain, these mushroom bulb things in their brain. And that makes them really pissed off when they go back into the group. And you see the same with I think with snails. I haven't looked it up, but I suspect, if you wanted me to have an educated guess, the tachykinin in the bit of brain of that snail had gone up. And it's something which is being looked at in people now, because we know the same thing happens in mammals, in the hypothalamus, in a small part of the hypothalamus. And it's one of the things which are now being explored as a driver of aggression in humans. And maybe this is something I'll talk about at the ABK conference in November. So these things are really interesting because you can trace them back through the species. So, I mean, should we draw the line at Drosophila, at fruit flies, I wonder? Or perhaps go up a little bit.
There's two powerful things though when we think about it, because some of Mother Nature, using that as a broad term, has seen the importance of experiencing, of feeling. It's amazing as a species now how much we want to devalue emotions and feeling,
Yeah.
and see them as being somehow, which should be be dismissing. But Mother Nature saw the value of that early on, and bits of that, as you say, even the things that we can see in those worms or those flies that have as manifested through to us as this apparent superior species are still just as important. And I think that's a really humbling thing, but especially when we think about the notion of what this talks about, which is emotional well-being matters, period. And also how much, like you said there, again, we are relying upon learning from these humble species regarding our own experience and what might be going on within our own hypothalamus, as you say, and what might be or dysregulating there regarding our behavioral output.
Without these tiny creatures, we wouldn't have anything like the amount of information we have on our own genomes, and what genes are involved in switching things on and off, the abnormalities in genes, a whole plethora of things that we know about people has been derived from looking at these animals. And the reason we look at them is simply because they're so small, and the number of things they have in them are much smaller. As I say, the C. elegans only has 306 neurons. The fruit fly has about 3,000, something like that. And of course, what happens with neurons themselves aren't important. It's the connections they make. It's the synaptic connections they make. And we have the complete connectome of both C. elegans and of Drosophila and of zebrafish larvae. And zebrafish larvae are important, not zebrafish. Larvae are important because they're mammals. Sorry, not mammals, they're vertebrates. Mammals didn't come along till 60 million years ago. They're one of the first vertebrates. And so they have all the brain structure of vertebrates that we have now. They have the same kind of brain divisions of telencephalon and diencephalon, etc., etc. The limbic system is all there. And it gives us a precursor for study. One important point I should make is when I say we have a complete connectome, which basically means we know where all the synapses are, we know how they're all connected together. It's only for individuals. So we know the connectome of an individual fly, or we know the 10 connectomes of 10 individual flies, or 20 individual nematode worms, C. elegans, or 4 zebrafish. It takes years and years and years to get them. Why this is important is because unlike a computer, if you think about your smartphone has computer chips in it. It's basically a network, isn't it? Which is the same as your brain. It has its own connectome. The connectome in your smartphone is identical to the connectome in all the other smartphones of your model. They're just clones. The interesting thing about animals is that when you compare one individual to another, even really small animals like C. elegans with 306 neurons, imagine how many connections are in there. It's different in every animal because the genes are slightly different. And more than that, it's born with a different network, and that network changes over time. It changes through epigenetic effects. We all know about epigenetics, what happens in the environment, etc., changes, switching genes on and off, and it's changed by plasticity. That's how we learn. So we're breaking and making new synapses all the time. I find that really interesting because for me, it means that we will never have a silicon machine which is conscious, which has a sense of self. It can't because its nervous system is just too simple. However many connections it may have, it's too inflexible. It might emulate us, but it's never going to be a living, breathing, thinking, feeling being like animals are. It's that complexity, and that's why consciousness is so hard to study, because every brain is different, and you might test it one day, and it's different the next day because something's happened. It's got new connections in. So you see stuff going on, but you've no idea what that actually means. There's no way of telling because it shifts. The other thing brains have is a thing called degeneracy, which is the equivalent of redundancy in aircraft. You hear about aircraft that have several systems in their flight systems. So if one flight system breaks and they can't operate the ailerons or the flaps or anything like that, there's another backup and they can go to that. So that's why flying is so safe. Animal nervous systems have the same thing. It's called redundancy. And what that means is it has lots of different ways to send signals from one part of the brain to another. So if you move down and touch your screen with your hand, with your arm, and you do it a couple of times and you do it again, the signals going from your brain to your arm are basically going to take different routes. You would imagine that it's going to be the same route, wouldn't you? Because the nerves are there, the same nerves are doing what they're doing. Your brain's doing the same thing. But it will be taking completely different routes every time. And so the connections are really fluid and dynamic. And that's why brains are so complicated.
Yeah.
And that's why little animals are so important to study, because you can look at something which is relatively small and try and figure out how the hell the damn thing works.
Yes, and also I think again it comes to this thing about being even our best endeavors, even our highest technology, we will never replicate something that is found in something that's even the most simplest of animal. I think this is important. And so this has been amazing, Robert. And we thought about the humble fruit fly and just how emotionally and socially aware they are. And I think, as you say, I'm really into snails now that I've learned more about their emotional and social richness, and the notion that snails themselves can have separation, forms of separation anxiety. I think it makes
Yeah,
us think about these things differently.
yeah. So it has a purpose, even that far back in evolution. It's there for something. It's there for something. And I find it fascinating. The deeper you dig in, the more of these things you find. So, I think it's a big mistake if you're a dog person. It's a really big mistake just to concentrate on studies about dogs and ignore everything else that pops into your inbox.
Yeah.
There's a treasure trove of stuff out there, and there's so much to learn. You need more than one lifetime to do it.
True.
I wish I was 14 again because I
You're,
want all that time back to do this stuff.
but you're plugged into the matrix anyway, Robert. I think so. But I don't know how, because you've learned a lot already. And this is the point. I think ultimately the only lived experience we can only ever truly look at is a study of one, which is us,
Yeah,
ourselves,
exactly.
and we know
Exactly.
what it feels like and the experiences and that kind of thing. And even that, you and I might have exactly the same neurological and physiological response, but feel it differently for
Yes.
how we interpret. This is where it gets even
Yes.
more layers. I think what we've ended up with here, which has been amazing, thank you so much, Robert, is this recognition that from an evolutionary point of view, and also when we do look at these species that we can often perceive as lesser than, the thing that we might swat away or the thing we
Yeah.
might, that the bits that are important from a Mother Nature point of view, which she's kept intact and are important for that species, are very much attached to self and the emotional experience and the feelings and connections and what goes on. And it just shows how important this stuff is when we ask that question. Well, when we make that statement, emotional well-being matters, because it really does, because Mother Nature's put it at the heart of the evolutionary side of things. And
Yes.
I think if we can look at the humble housefly differently, for me, it was looking at the humble garden snail differently.
Yeah. Fruit fly, house flies. Yeah,
Fruit fly, sorry, fruit fly, sorry, yes.
Drosophila. It's the ones flying around your bananas.
Am I
Tiny
upgrading?
little things.
Is a housefly an upgrade from a fruit fly? Are they
I
even
don't
more?
know. I don't know. I'm sure there are studies on it, but
Depth?
they're not. The reason fruit fly is so important is because you don't have to do anything with it. If you study fruit flies and you want to study um, MS or some strange disease in people or some other animal, all you have to do is breed fruit flies, examine every single one of the children as they come along, and you will find mutations that mimic what you're looking for. What you then do is you breed that one, you get more flies with the mutation, and then you can start studying the genes that cause that mutation. That's why fruit flies are important, because they breed really well, and they mutate really easily all by themselves. And we've learned so much about genetic diseases in other species from fruit flies. In fact, everything we know probably stems from studies in fruit flies.
Yeah.
And more recently, we've started looking at their nervous systems and how they can inform us about mental illness and psychiatric deviations in people and of course other species. But we always spend the money on people, but we can then take that data and apply it to the animals we deal with.
And if we can look at this is what this group's about. This is what it's set up really, because like you say, it's inviting us to consider more than the kind of general look. And I think to have a conversation like we've just had, where would you have that? Where we've covered everything from
Well, quite.
human to the
I
dogs
know.
down to the humble fruit fly. And I think
And conscious rocks.
exactly. We'll do a rock special at some point, but we'll have to think about that one. But I think and perhaps the line can come below fruit flies. We can go we can explore that more. But for me, I think if we can look at that, say that snail differently, you can't not then look at your dog differently, your cat, your
No,
horse,
no,
and most of all, what you see in the mirror. I think
exactly.
it's giving us, it's being humble enough to understand that we can learn from other, but also to give ourselves grace as well in that process, I think, Robert. And
Exactly. Yeah, I agree.
well, you're an inspiration as always. I knew this would be an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Robert. I really appreciate today. We'll
That's been my
definitely
pleasure.
get together again in the near future. We're both talking at Daniel Shaw's Animal Behavioral Kent Conference in November, which will be
Yeah.
great. And do check out the stuff with Robert that's on the Pet Remedy platform, and also some of the things that Robert and I have done as well. And there'll definitely be more Robert in the future on different things. But this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you, Robert, and thank you
Yeah,
everybody.
my pleasure, Andy. It was great. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was great. It just helps us. It was very geeky and but very accessible. And I think the most important thing is this notion that, as I say, emotional well-being matters, and it does. And Mother Nature has put that right at the central heart of our connection to the world around us, and the needs to feel safe and to have a life that feels, as you say, that kind of that notion of a life, especially for us humans, to really think about what happiness is and well-being is actually for us. And it ain't about consumerism a lot of the time, actually, I think. That's for sure. Great. Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Great to see you from all over the world today, and to have such a good crowd for the live. If you're watching on catch up, still put some stuff in, because I'll check in and have a look at things. But yeah, thank you so much. Do check out the Summer of Love videos. They're starting to come out now. There's a special playlist on the Pet Remedy YouTube channel. These are just 10-minute little chunks thinking about emotional well-being for different species. So we've got a few conversations on the horse. We had Kate Thornton talking about the sense of smell in horses. Robert, fascinating. I didn't even know there was 2 olfactory lobes for horses. That's a new one for me. Daniel Lebeck talking about reptiles. We've got cats. We've got dogs. These little snippets, especially designed for the general public, really, to think about emotional well-being for their animals.
We got the whole zoo.
Yes, exactly. We'll build up to all these things. And talking about, we've mentioned Karen a few times. Karen's going to come and do a series in this group, actually. So that's going to be great. That's amazing. Do check out Robert's chat with Karen Pinner over on my platform, the Dog Centre Care channel. Lots of Robert there. And Robert, you had a series, of course, of guests, and Karen was one of them, talking about Mira.
Yes, yes.
MHERA, and Karen's excellent book, Mood Matters. I really recommend it. And yeah, your conversation there was excellent. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Robert. Thank you. And
Excellent.
see you soon. Take care.
Peace, everyone.